You might have had this moment before where you look at your garden and think, maybe it just needs a little more fertilizer. And it feels like the right thing to do. After all, more nutrients should mean more growth, right? But here's where things start to get a little confusing. In many home gardens, adding more fertilizer doesn't actually solve the problem. In fact, over time, it can quietly make things worse. I've seen plants grow faster for a short while, greener leaves, quicker shoots, and then, slowly, something changes. Growth stalls. The plant looks fine, but doesn't really thrive. And that's the part most people don't expect. From my experience, the issue isn't that we care too much. It's that we often respond too quickly, without really seeing what the plant is going through. So in this video, we're going to take a slower look at what's actually happening when we over-fertilize, how it affects the roots, the soil, and the long-term health of your garden. And more importantly, how to step back just enough to let your plants grow the way they're meant to. There's a very common belief in gardening that if a plant isn't growing well, it probably just needs more nutrients. And to be fair, that idea makes sense at first. We see fertilizer as food, so naturally, more food should mean more growth. But plants don't quite work the way we often imagine. In many home gardens, growth problems aren't caused by a lack of fertilizer alone. Sometimes, the issue is happening somewhere deeper, in the soil, in the roots, or in how everything is interacting together. What I've noticed over the years is that when something feels off in the garden, our first instinct is to add something, instead of stepping back to observe. And that small habit can quietly lead us in the wrong direction. Because when we treat fertilizer like a quick fix, we stop asking a more important question. Is the plant actually lacking nutrients? Or is it struggling to use what's already there? One of the most helpful shifts in gardening is understanding that plants don't actually eat fertilizer the way we think they do. They don't take in chunks of nutrients directly. Instead, everything depends on what's happening in the soil and around the roots. From what I've seen over time, roots are not just passive straws pulling things in. They interact with the soil in a much more complex way, responding to moisture, oxygen, microbial life, and the balance of nutrients already present. In many cases, even if nutrients are available, the plant may not be able to use them properly. Sometimes the soil is too compact. Sometimes it holds too much water or not enough air. And sometimes there's simply too much of one thing and not enough balance. So when we add more fertilizer on top of that, we're not always helping the plant absorb more. We might actually be making it harder for the roots to do their job. When we look at soil, it's easy to think of it as just something that holds the plant in place. But in reality, soil is much more than that. It's a living system, constantly changing, constantly interacting with the roots. From my experience, one of the biggest shifts in gardening happens when you stop seeing soil as dirt and start seeing it as an environment. A healthy soil isn't just about nutrients. It's about structure, airflow, moisture, and the life within it. In many home gardens, when we add fertilizer too often, we're not just feeding the plant, we're also changing that entire system, sometimes in ways we don't immediately notice. The balance between soil, roots, water, and air is very delicate. And when that balance is disrupted, even good intentions can slowly lead to weaker plants over time. At first, when a plant receives more nutrients than it needs, the changes can actually look positive. Leaves may become greener, growth may seem faster, and for a short time, it can feel like things are finally working. But this early response can be a bit misleading. In many cases, what we're seeing isn't stronger growth, it's just faster surface-level development. From what I've observed, when nutrients are too abundant, plants often focus on quick, soft growth instead of building strength over time. Stems may become weaker, leaves may grow larger but thinner. And while everything looks more active on the surface, the deeper systems, the roots, the structure, may not be keeping up. So what looks like progress can quietly become the beginning of imbalance. At this point, everything might still look quite active in the garden. New leaves are forming, stems are extending, and from a distance, it can feel like the plant is doing well. But not all growth is the same. From my experience, there's a big difference between a plant that grows quickly and a plant that grows strong. Fast growth often focuses on size, but strong growth builds structure. And when too much fertilizer is involved, plants tend to grow in a softer, more fragile way. You might notice stems that can't support their own weight, or leaves that tear easily under simple conditions. It's not always obvious at first, but over time, that kind of growth becomes harder to maintain and more vulnerable to stress. As this pattern continues, something quieter begins to change beneath the surface: the roots. From what I've seen over time, roots respond very directly to their environment. When nutrients are constantly available in high amounts, the plant doesn't need to search as actively anymore. And slowly, the root system can become less extensive, less motivated to spread deeper or wider into the soil. It's not that the plant is choosing to grow weaker. It's simply adapting to what feels like an easy environment. But that ease comes with a trade-off, because when roots stay shallow, the plant becomes more dependent on surface conditions. And over time, that can make it less stable and less resilient when conditions change. As this pattern continues, the changes don't just stay in the plant. They begin to affect the soil itself. From what I've observed, when fertilizer is added too often, the balance in the soil can slowly start to shift. It's not always something you can see right away, but over time, certain nutrients can build up more than others, and that creates an imbalance beneath the surface. In some cases, salts begin to accumulate, and that can make it harder for roots to absorb water properly. So even if the soil looks fine, the environment around the roots may no longer feel supportive. And once that balance is off, it becomes harder for the whole system to function the way it should. There's another layer in the soil that we don't often see, but it plays a quiet and important role in how plants grow. That's the microbial life living in the soil. In a healthy garden, this underground community helps break down organic matter and slowly makes nutrients available in a balanced way. It's not fast, and it's not always visible, but over time, it creates a stable environment for roots to rely on. When fertilizer is added too often, this natural process can start to weaken, because instead of working with the soil life, we begin to override it. And slowly, the system becomes less active, less balanced, and less able to support the plant in the long run. By the time a plant shows clear signs of stress, the issue has often been building for a while. But long before that, there are usually small signals, subtle changes that are easy to miss, especially if you're not looking for them. From my experience, one of the earliest signs is when growth starts to slow, even though the plant still looks relatively healthy. You might notice fewer new leaves, or growth that seems to pause without a clear reason. Sometimes the soil stays damp longer than expected, or feels heavier than it used to. And occasionally, leaves may look slightly off. Not damaged, just not quite right. These are the kinds of signals that don't stand out right away, but if you catch them early, they can tell you a lot about what's happening below the surface. One of the easiest traps to fall into is judging a plant by how it looks on the surface, especially when the leaves are green, full, and visually healthy. Because green leaves can be very convincing. From a distance, everything might seem fine, even thriving. But color alone doesn't tell the whole story. In many cases, plants that receive too much fertilizer will produce lush green leaves, while other parts of the plant quietly struggle. The roots may be weak, the structure may be soft, and the plant may be growing, but not strengthening. So while the surface looks healthy, the foundation underneath may be slowly falling out of balance. At this stage, something very common begins to happen. The plant slows down, and our instinct is to help. So we add more fertilizer. It feels like the right response. After all, if growth is slowing, it must need more support. But this is where a quiet cycle can begin. The plant struggles. We add more, and the imbalance deepens. From what I've seen, this pattern doesn't come from neglect. It comes from care, just applied too quickly. And over time, each small adjustment can move the plant further away from balance instead of closer to it. At some point, it's no longer just about what we add, it's about how often we react. When something looks slightly off in the garden, it's very natural to want to fix it right away. A small change in color, a pause in growth, a leaf that doesn't look quite right. And before we've had time to observe, we adjust. We water a bit more. We add something new. We try to correct the direction quickly. But plants don't respond instantly. They move slowly, and they need time to adjust. So when we keep changing the conditions too often, the plant doesn't get the chance to settle. And over time, that constant shifting can create more stress than stability. At first, these changes may seem small, almost unnoticeable. A slightly slower growth here, a minor imbalance there. Nothing that feels urgent. But over time, these small shifts begin to add up. The roots don't develop as deeply, the soil becomes less balanced, and the plant slowly loses its resilience. It doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, quiet, and easy to overlook until the effects become harder to reverse. From what I've seen, by the time a plant clearly struggles, the underlying issues have often been building for weeks, sometimes even longer. And at that point, it takes more time and more patience to bring things back into balance. At this point, it becomes important to understand something very simple. Fertilizer can support a plant, but it cannot fix everything. It doesn't improve soil structure. It doesn't restore balance on its own. And it certainly doesn't replace the role of healthy roots or a living, active soil system. From what I've seen, many gardening problems don't come from a lack of nutrients. They come from conditions that prevent the plant from using what's already there. So when we rely too heavily on fertilizer, we may be addressing the symptom, but not the cause. And over time, that can lead us further away from a truly healthy garden. So if adding more isn't always the answer, then when does fertilizer actually help? From my experience, it works best when there's a clear need, not just a reaction to slow growth. For example, when the soil has been depleted over time, or when a plant has been in the same container for too long. In those cases, a gentle, measured addition can support the plant, but only when the rest of the system is already in balance. On the other hand, if the soil is compacted, or holding too much water, or lacking airflow, adding more fertilizer won't solve the problem. It may simply add another layer on top of what's already out of balance. So the question becomes less about how much to add and more about whether the plant is ready to use it. At some point, the real shift in gardening doesn't come from doing more. It comes from seeing more clearly. Instead of asking, what should I add next? We begin to ask, what is the plant actually telling me? From my experience, this change is subtle, but it makes everything slower and more intentional. You start to notice patterns, how the soil behaves after watering, how leaves respond over a few days, not just a moment. And instead of reacting right away, you give the plant time. Time to adjust, time to recover, time to show you what it really needs. And often, that's when the garden begins to feel more stable, without needing constant intervention. Once you begin to notice these patterns, the next step isn't to stop everything at once. It's to adjust, slowly. From my experience, plants respond much better to gradual changes rather than sudden shifts. Instead of cutting out fertilizer completely, You might reduce the frequency or use a smaller amount. And then observe. Give the plant time to respond to that change. Watch how the soil behaves, how the leaves adjust, and whether the overall balance begins to return. Because in many cases, it's not about doing less overnight. It's about doing things more gently and with more awareness. Over time, the focus in gardening begins to shift from feeding the plant to supporting the soil. Because when the soil is healthy, the plant often takes care of itself. From what I've seen, strong gardens are not built on constant input. They're built on systems that support themselves. Rich soil, balanced structure, active life beneath the surface. These are the things that make growth more stable and less dependent on quick fixes. So instead of asking, "What should I add today?" we begin to ask, how can I improve the environment this plant is growing in? So when we step back and look at the bigger picture, it's not that fertilizer is bad. It's simply one small part of a much larger system. Plants don't grow well because we add more. They grow well when the environment supports them. Healthy roots, balanced soil, stable conditions over time. These are the things that truly make a difference. And often, the best thing we can do is not to rush in with another solution, but to slow down, observe, and give the system time to work. Because in the long run, a stable garden isn't built on constant input. It's built on understanding, patience, and balance. Thank you for spending this time in the garden with me. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more quiet, practical gardening insights. I'll see you again in the next one.